Well, thanks everybody for joining today. My name's Sam. I work here at Worksome, and today we've got two, as I described in a post yesterday, two actual experts in the UK contractor and compliance space. Before I introduce Rebecca and Chris, and well, they introduce themselves, and we get into the meat of this. The whole point of today is to help kind of demystify and really simplify what's happening in April in the UK. For those that, you might have seen that the write-up, there's a, obviously you've signed up for the webinar to understand what this joint and several liability change really means. But really, we want to help you understand what's changing with the upcoming Finance Bill Act. It is coming to effect this April. What it in simple terms really means is that companies and staffing agencies will be liable for unpaid PAYE tax within umbrella arrangements. So what this actually means is that HMRC can look upstream to recruiters and clients. So, for those of you in the audience who are in HR or talent or procurement and tax, or if you're running staffing agencies, this Finance Bill Act really means that you've got to start looking down your supply chain and understanding how people are getting paid and what they're getting paid. Obviously, in 2021, we had IR35 reform, which was really focused on the self-employed population of the workforce, the contract workforce. This change will be focused very much on those who are being taxed. HMRC has identified a £500 million gap where there's very likely non-compliance in umbrella arrangements. So really, for those of you in TA, procurement, HR, client side, or whether you're running a recruitment business, this is a must understand topic with only 3 months till the change is made. So without further ado, in fact, before I jump to Rebecca and Chris, any questions, please do pop them in the chat. We'll be addressing all questions afterwards, so you'll be able to ask Rebecca and Chris directly with any questions you've got on the topic. This session is being recorded, so you can come back to it at a later date. You can share it with colleagues, friends, family, loved ones. You can, and obviously we'll be writing up a nice summary of everything that was discussed, so that you can read it in your own time. But right, without further ado, ladies first. Rebecca, if you want to introduce yourself, and then we'll get into Chris, and we'll get into the questions.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rebecca Seeley-Harris. I'm an expert in IR35 employment status and off-payroll working, but I have done a lot of work in the umbrella reforms, and I actually produced a document earlier in the year that was commissioned to understand how the new Chapter 11 would work in practice and indeed joint and several liability. Thank you. So do you want me to jump straight in, Sam?
Yeah, go for it. And Chris, you can introduce yourself, I think, in your first question. Yeah, let's go.
Okay. So to understand what the legislation is, it's introduced by the Finance Bill, which has been published in December, so it's now an Act. It's a bit confusing with the bill because it was 2025-26, because there already was a Finance Bill. So that then introduces Chapter 11 of ITPA. So this is going to be a new chapter within the ITPA legislation in 2003. So firstly, to explain why HMRC is doing this, it's because the impetus is largely based on fraud. So there were a couple of cases, one which was DUCAS and one which was PPS Umbrella. Both are in court for allegedly misappropriating funds. And I want to say that because I have actually been contacted about it. Basically, DUCAS misappropriated apparently 71 million within the labour supply chain, and PPS, it was only 7.2 million, but there you go. So this is very basically a situation where the NHS was paying recruitment companies who had an umbrella in the chain to assuming that the workers were going to be on payroll, but by the time it got to the umbrella company, they decided to pay the workers off payroll and kept what would have been the employment taxes. In DUCAS's case, it was 71 million. So you can understand why HMRC and the government's a little bit upset about this and want to take action. That's one of the reasons anyway, and I think that's probably one of the main drivers. However, the due diligence within the labour supply chain probably hasn't been up to scratch. And actually with both DUCAS and PPS Umbrella, if you read the case law, you can see where things like the dodgy pay slips that were provided by the umbrellas to the agencies which weren't picked up, why due diligence is really important. So to look at the legislation itself, Chapter 11, there are 2 points. One is the umbrella company arrangement. One is the purported umbrella. So starting with the umbrella company arrangement, this is the kind of basic provisions which include the joint and several liability, which will come into place in April this year. This is why everyone needs to take notice. So this is what Section 61Y actually says. And I'm not going to, I want you to concentrate on the relationships rather than the labels. So the worker is employed by a third person. The third person is an entity in the business of supplying labour. So, you know, that can be any business that is supplying labour in which the worker has no material interest. So don't worry about that. That comes into play a bit later. So you've got a third person in the entity of, in the business of supplying labour. The worker's personal services are provided to an end client via that company arrangement. So this can include a lot of companies. Then each relevant party in the supply chain is jointly and severally liable, along with the umbrella company, for any PAYE amounts which qualify as an umbrella company payment. Now, I have to add, actually, that this Chapter 11 just talks about PAYE, but it does include NICs as well. That is going to be in separate legislative provisions. This is an absolute liability with no statutory defence. So it doesn't matter how well you do your due diligence. If the umbrella company defaults, if you are the relevant party, you will be liable. So who's the relevant party? I think there's been a lot of misunderstandings about this, because I think some parties in the labour supply chain don't realise that they will be implicated. So first and foremost, if there is an umbrella company in the chain, the top agency or MSP will be the ones who are in direct contractual relationship with the client will be liable. So if it's an MSP, if you have a direct contract with the client, then you'll be liable. If you aren't in contract, but you're contracting with the agency, then it may be the top agency that's liable. If there's no umbrella in the chain, and this is really important, and the agency employs the worker and pays PAYE, then the end client is liable. So this is where there's no umbrella in the chain. So actually, in a way, the legislation does encourage there to be an umbrella in the chain if you don't want the end client to be liable. If the umbrella and the agency are connected, then the end client will be liable. So if you do have an umbrella in the chain, but they are connected to the agency, and connected is defined in legislation, then the end client will be liable. And I think a lot of people don't know this. How you find out whether an umbrella company and an agency are connected, you could perhaps go to Companies House, check on the directors, find out whether the directors are also directors of an agency. That's a good way of checking. If the worker is paid by PAYE, but is on a contract for services, you are going to be looking at Chapter 7, which is an existing deeming provision. So that is going to be a very difficult situation, because the Chapter 11 does actually exclude, in certain circumstances, other parts of the deeming provisions. The deeming provisions, for those who don't know, are all the chapters within ITPA. So Chapter 7, Chapter 8, Chapter 9, Chapter 10, Chapter 11. So there's going to be a kind of, I've already heard in the market that a lot of organisations are sort of saying, well, if we pay the PAYE, which satisfies HMRC, but we have the workers on a contract for services, then we're not going to be under Chapter 11, and joint and several liability won't apply. In certain circumstances, it still will. So you have to be really careful and understand what your labour supply chain looks like. So the second part is the purported umbrella, and this is Section 61Z1. It will apply if it is reasonable to suppose that a person would assume that the purported umbrella is the employer of the individual. So this is trying to capture those situations where, for example, DUCAS and PP's umbrella, the NHS assumed that those workers were going to be paid on payroll, but in fact they were paid off payroll. So this part of the legislation is covering that situation. So whether or how it's going to work in practice, how reasonable to suppose and an assumption is going to work in practice, I don't know. It remains to be seen. But the fact that the purported umbrella has been included within the legislation is a defence in itself. So as with all legislation, legislation is there to deter, because HMRC don't want to be taking action. They want everyone to comply. So deterrence is the first point with joint and several liability, and then of course if it is actually misdemeanor, then they can apply it. So I think that's a kind of really basic rundown, and perhaps I'll hand back to Sam.
Yeah, thanks for that, Rebecca. So I think, you know, for end clients and staffing agencies there, I think, you know, it seems pretty clear that, you know, you've got to understand what's going on in your umbrella supply chain. I think, Chris, bringing you into the conversation here, so obviously a chance to introduce yourself and give your perspective, but I think for, you know, we very purposefully invited you to the call here because I think it's really interesting to hear the umbrella perspective. You know, Parasol being a really well respected and you know, one of the leading umbrellas in the UK. How are umbrellas preparing for this?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. So just a quick intro. I'm Chris Blow. I'm the Director of Compliance for Parasol. And to answer your question succinctly, we've been waiting for this. You know, as a compliant provider, we've been waiting for this kind of interaction from the government for many years. And you know, sitting there and watching the budget as I do every year, because I'm a bit sad like that. Hearing the use of the word umbrella company was almost kind of, whoa, what's going on here? But then followed up by, you know, to stop the exploitative practices of these arrangements was quite worrying. And I think the initial reaction to what was set out, you probably agree on this, Rebecca, was again, there's a bit of a misunderstanding in terms of what we do here. And just quickly, I'm not going to go into the detail like Rebecca, but we'd given 3 options, weren't we, from the consultation? And one was kind of mandated due diligence, one was a transfer of debt, and then we had this option 3, which at the time seemed the nuclear option. This was transferring ultimately the responsibility for payment onto the recruitment agency, which had various connotations as to whether the umbrella company could receive a gross pay for tax, which pay-as-you-earn reference number you would use, which thankfully for the likes of having Rebecca and having FCSA and all those organisations that came together and collaborated, we were able to engage with HMRC and DBT on these points and get across our view. And you know, we've arrived at joint and several liability, and I think just circling back to companies like ourselves, that isn't that far away from what we are doing now and have tried to do for the last 15-20 years, basically. There is now an imposition. You know, this is all labelled under the fact this is umbrella reform, umbrella regulation, but the onus has really been passed on to the agency or the end client where there's no umbrella. So it's our job, and part of our preparations is adding that reassurance, is making sure that the recruitment businesses and end clients understand that this is a risk management exercise. That's fundamental, okay, that there is risk there, and to make sure that we can provide that reassurance and they understand what that means and what the questions that they need to ask of their providers, basically. If that makes sense.
Yeah. We'll get to what umbrellas are doing about this, because I think there's it's been a really interesting kind of 6 months from the umbrella industry in the UK, where you know, it's been a lot of change, but I think a lot of it's been very positive, really, isn't it? But going back to you, Rebecca, if you're an end client here or a recruitment business, and the majority of the audience here are end client and recruitment business, either recruitment business owners or, like I said, senior HR, procurement, and tax and legal. Where do you start? You know, if now the liability is confirmed, you know, you're looking at your supply chain. What areas should you review first? Where do you think the risk, you know, that the highest risk sits, or is that even the question to ask? Like, you know, where do you go from here?
Well, I think actually I want to pick up on Chris's point first of all, is why joint and several liability, in order to explain why it's in the place and why it's important, because, you know, as Chris mentioned, there were 3 other options. One which was due diligence, and that's what the last government preferred, but the Labour government didn't. A transfer of debt, HMRC don't want to have to take action in order to recover the debt. So the joint and several liability was the only way that they could improve the situation and stop these massive frauds. So when people sort of complain about joint and several liability, there weren't really any other options that would solve the sort of compliance problem and put HMRC in the position where they could stop this fraud. So I think in terms of what, first of all, you need to map your labour supply chain. And I've been saying this for years because, you know, I advise end clients on payroll working under IR35, actually not IR35 anymore, because IR35 actually only applies to small businesses. So if you're a medium or large business or public sector, you're dealing with off payroll working. And, you know, I've been telling clients, you must know who's in your labour supply chain because of these situations, because of what happens. So first of all, map your labour supply chain and find out whether you do have an umbrella in the chain or whether the agency is employing the worker. So they might have them on PAYE, but are they actually employing them, or are they putting them on what's called a contract services? And there's a lot more that's going to come into play because the umbrella regulations, so this is tax policy we're dealing with here with Chapter 11. The entire umbrella reforms are dealing with the tax policy first and then the umbrella regulations, which are due to be consulted on. So they were due to be consulted on by the end of 2025. That didn't happen for various reasons, partly because of the delay in the Employment Rights Bill, because it is all part of that. But that has been postponed, and we're expecting that, you know, any day now. I think it also might be postponed or waiting on the Fair Work Agency setting up, which is due to launch in April. So the umbrella regulations are going to deal with other points of conduct with umbrella companies. But if I was the government, I would be taking this opportunity to look at the conduct regulations in their entirety to make sure that the whole of the labour supply chain works and their conduct is reviewed. So this would be umbrella companies and agencies. So, you know, the first thing to do is acknowledge that there's going to be more legislation coming. The likelihood is the conduct regulations are going to change. There's going to be more impetus on the agencies, I should imagine, and of course the umbrella companies. The government might regulate them, for example, although actually, as I understand it, the umbrella company market or industry is shrinking anyway. So map it and then audit it, and obviously we can go on to what you would include within audits.
Yeah, good advice. And Chris, so on that, on the you know, will the umbrella companies be regulated? The umbrella companies, to an extent, you know, they self-regulate right now. There's a couple of organisations, but what are umbrellas doing? You know, within those groups? You mentioned the FCSA, and there are others. There are tools that have come out in recent times as well. What are umbrella companies doing to give end clients and staffing agencies, I guess, a peace of mind, but actually practically do something about this?
Yeah, like just going back to the point I said before, we have to deliver that reassurance. This is an issue that, you know, has come from our industry, but there's a large part of it that has no part to play in those contrived mechanisms, and you know, have for years been trying to get this across to agencies and end clients that you need to do this due diligence. And you know, FCSA have been around since 2008, and that was a step by organisations to say, we understand that there's no actual regulation, but we want to set a standard, you know, in line with employment regulations, in line with tax regulations, and almost put yourself there on a pedestal to be shot at, because that's what's effectively happened. So I think FCSA and accreditation has been a really useful tool, and something that if you were an agency or a client, you should continue to insist upon. Okay, there have been, over the last 3 or 4 years, newly introduced tools that I think allow JSL to work as well as it could do, and how the government wants it to work. Because going back to your point, Rebecca, this is in the first instance about behavioural change, isn't it? It's making sure that, and we talked about this before, and I'm going to say it. You know, conversations I had with HMRC revolved around, they had to arrive at something that made the agencies and end clients were relevant give a shit where that money went to. It was no longer pass pass it over and look the other way. That just couldn't happen. That's why we have these issues. That's why we have the cases, the alleged cases that Rebecca talked about there. So they wanted to put the agency and the end client on the hook where it was relevant. And I believe now we've got the tools to do that. So we have the likes of SafeRec and we have the likes of VeryPay that will allow you to ensure what I see as the three critical points here is that where you're working with an umbrella company, you want to make sure that your workers are paid correctly. Okay, so that the pay slip all adds up. Okay, and you can just get the starting position, the end position, and everything kind of makes sense. You need to make sure that that payment has been remitted to HMRC correctly. Okay, and then the third and final step is, has that tax and national insurance, when that's built in, that's all been paid over. Okay, and if you can get that, then you could be reasonably comfortable that that umbrella company is doing it in the correct way. What you have now is a push for compliant companies that were FCSA accredited are now getting either VeryPay or SafeRec accredited to add that level of assurance. And I think when you are, taking Rebecca's advice, when you are looking down your supply chain, that's the kind of thing you're looking for. And if you haven't got that, why aren't they willing to do that? And I know that there are still some reputable companies who are going through those processes, but if they haven't by the 6th of April, that should be a flag really to say, we want these. And you talked about before, Rebecca, a contraction in the umbrella market itself. We are seeing stipulations on PSLs now from MSP providers and from large agencies that are saying you have to have FCSA accreditation. That's always been there, if I'm being honest, but now it's a SafeRec and a VeryPay, as well as little add-ons and bolt-ons that provide the agency to get comfortable with what that umbrella company is doing, basically.
Yeah, it feels to me like that's one of the kind of key actions that's been happening over the last 6 months, whether it's end clients or recruiters. There's been a push to, like you said, Rebecca, actually understanding how many umbrella companies are in the supply chain, paying the workers, but to kind of make the homework easier ultimately. Check for the umbrellas that are FCSA approved, check whether they're using something like a SafeRec, and reduce them. Right?
I think though that we're going into a new era now, so. I think things like accreditation, there are only two, well, actually, there's a couple, or there's a few accreditation companies. You've got to check which accreditation companies that you use. Obviously, FCSA is probably the oldest one. Yeah. There's also another one called Professional Passport, but as I understand it, they've changed their practice. I'm not quite sure. They're advocating a different way of working, so I'm not sure. They're not actually an accreditation company. They are a private organisation that I think audit umbrella companies. So I think the only one that actually accredits is FCSA, and I'm assuming that they will change theirs because their accreditation is annually. And I know that's been criticised, but with everything else, if you've got your payslip checkers, you've got things like SafeRec. I noticed a question there actually about the viability of things like SafeRec and VeryPay. And it is absolutely correct that the payslip checkers are, although checking in real time, you are checking a payslip which has been paid. So it's historical. What you need to be is you need to be ahead of time. So things like accreditation are useful, payslip checkers are useful, but they're not going to protect you. So you need to be doing other things like, checking the history of the company, that they are compliant, particularly in things like Companies House. So if there's any time over the last, 10 years or something like that, where there's been any misdemeanors at all, checking that they're compliant with HMRC. There's going to be a lot of probably amendments to the contract where you need to have audit rights. You need to be able to step in very quickly if there's any kind of HMRC activity that the company needs to let you know about. There is a lot of things that you can do as a background check, and obviously a consolidation of the umbrella market, not working with lots of umbrellas, because that, that does impact on your kind of admin. So it may be that you decide to work with less umbrella companies, or maybe just one. And I understand that, as Chris was saying, that the PSLs are shrinking, that they're just looking at the bigger companies. I'm also unfortunately hearing that a lot of the smaller companies are going to go out of business because of the risk. Which is understandable. So there's a lot to do, but I think one of the purposes of the legislation is to make sure that due diligence is being done, because previously it wasn't.
Yeah, I'd agree there. And you see a lot of narrative, don't you? And it's accurate. Due diligence is great, but there's going to be no excuse for this. But this is about prevention. It's about making sure that doesn't happen. And what's kind of lost in this whole kind of area is that there have been lots of agencies, lots of end clients, and lots of umbrella companies that have made these steps to be compliant out of their own choice for many, many years. Okay, and this legislation is not necessarily aimed at those companies, but they're the only companies that are actually reacted to it. Yeah, there's lots of other companies over there, that purported 200,000 plus workers going through contrived mechanisms. I heard of one yesterday that they're not listening to this. They're not joining these webinars. They're saying, well, we'll just make hay until we get stopped. And do I think that as of the 6th of April, that stops overnight? No, I do not. This will be about awareness, education and behavioural change in the first instance. And that's why it's really critical that end clients understand and ask these questions of their supply chain. Because again, going back to that point, we had one yesterday, an individual was forced to use a particular umbrella company by the agency, no other choice. Okay. And a very quick check for me on Companies House linked those back to an organisation in the Isle of Man. Okay, which was, it took me 2 minutes, yeah? But that's my job. Yeah, so it's like, but it's looking, like you said before, checking Companies House, making sure that you're comfortable. But to do that, you have to audit your supply chain. You have to understand, and go back to our point before, you have to give a shit where you are paying that money to. And as long as you do that and you have that in mind, then I think you'll be able to arrive at somewhere where you can be very comfortable.
Yeah, and given that so much of the audience here on the call are from end clients, I think let's just have I'd love to ask your opinions on the advice you'd give to the the HR talent and procurement community who are on the call here, as to Rebecca, you mentioned, and well, both of you have mentioned knowing who you're paying, understanding the supply chains. Ultimately, the buck does start with you, right? But doing that once isn't going to solve this problem, right? Can you give some advice for everybody on the call here, around the kind of operational and governance expectations here, and how to do that on an ongoing basis? I think that'd be really valuable.
Yeah, I think this is a much wider topic. If we're talking to sort of HR and compliance and things like that, because we're talking about the labour supply chain, so it's a very good opportunity to audit your outsourcing and how you're doing it. Because as I mentioned before, you've got these other deeming provisions. So you've got Chapter 7, which is the so-called agency tax legislation. That's commonly known as Section 44. So that is where if you're an agency and you're employing, or if you have the worker on PAYE, not employing, I hasten to add, that you are then supposed to be paying the tax. Then you've got Chapter 8, which is R35, which now only applies to small businesses. So the consultants or the contractors should still be doing their own assessment. Chapter 9, managed service company legislation. Chapter 10 is the new off-payroll working reforms, where the end client must look at their how the contractors are being supplied and whether they do indeed think they're off payroll or not. And then now we've got Chapter 11, which is joint and several liability. So when either the end client or the agency or the MSP are looking at the labour supply chain, they need to really look at how the contractors are going to be engaged, because an umbrella company is only one way of engaging. But if you are going to engage off payroll, then you've got to make sure that you are doing it compliantly. So it is, now a serious game of compliance within the labour supply chain, being able to navigate all the deeming provisions. So, like I said before, you need to map how you are engaging. So if you're an MSP, you need to be engaging with the end client to understand the sort of engagement process. The end client needs to understand how they're engaging. There are different ways, obviously you might want to take advice on what the best form of engagement is. Don't necessarily dump the umbrellas just because of this legislation, because, as Chris said, there are a lot of compliant umbrellas, and unfortunately, the legislation is targeting the non-compliant ones, but the compliant ones are obviously going to be impacted by it. So, umbrella route, and incidentally, this is the reason why HMRC did go down the joint and several liability route, to save, in essence, the umbrella industries. Because if it hadn't done it, it may have just cut out. One of the options was, of course, which the TUC would be to actually cut out the umbrella companies completely. So HMRC and the government have decided that, the umbrellas are good employers, the compliant ones, that they should be kept in chain. So HR predominantly need to map the engagement, and then once they've decided what the engagement is and which deeming provision it comes under, you've got to establish whether whoever's paying the worker is, if they are paying PAYE, how are they engaging that worker? Is it as employed, which in case it comes under Chapter 11, but they might be engaging them under contract for services, for example, which is called the elective deduction model. HMRC do not like this practice. So you also need to establish that, because there's going to be a lot of operators out there who are going to try and take themselves out of Chapter 11. And if they have the worker on a contract for services and they're not employing the worker, that takes them into Chapter 7, which avoids joint and several liability. So for any of the end clients or agencies that are looking at this, you need to be looking at the labour supply chain compliance in its entirety.
I've got one question that's come in here. It says, it's interesting to hear you talk, Rebecca, about the difference between Chapter 7 and 11. Do you think clients will actively try and deem as much as they can as services? So get your kind of crystal.
I'm already hearing it, and I was hearing it on the lead up to once joint and several liability was announced. I was getting questions of how do we avoid it, and one of the avoidances, what happens if we pay PAYE. So incidentally, there are different ways of doing this. So an elective deduction model is typically paying PAYE NICs, but not engaging the worker as a so-called LIMBY worker. So this is where it crosses over into DBT, Department of Business territory. So if you're engaging somebody as a LIMBY worker, they are being paid holiday pay and all the statutory payments. Now, I've done a lot of asking. I've worked with HMRC a lot. I work with DBT a lot to understand, because this falls between the two departments. So I think there is going to be a likelihood that a lot of operators, perhaps the non-compliant ones, which I hope nobody will work with, are going to try. I know actually FCSA banned.
Yeah, we raised it. Yeah, so FCSA banned it, and we raised this, didn't we, as part of the faux consultation process that was in place. And frustratingly, DBT kind of explained, well, because you've got a move by a Labour government here, not making it political, to enhance worker rights. And what they failed to see, that by introducing this and not closing the door, it was that it opened it up to actually putting people through to get paid without any rights whatsoever, basically.
Yeah, no, I'm working on that a lot behind the scenes. I've been working with DBT because of this consultations that are coming up, and I have fully explained what the elective deduction model is, because funnily enough, as an independent advisor, I was working between HMRC and DBT because each thought the other one would be responsible. Yeah. But actually, if HMRC is getting all the taxes it should be, like PAYE, NICs, all the holiday pay is being paid, their requirements are met. So something like this will be with DBT, and this will come under the consultation on the umbrella regulations under conduct regs, which is something that should be addressed. And they do now understand that, I don't know what they're going to do with it, but I think practices like, if you're paying PAYE, and actually I wrote something called the Employment Status Roadmap, which I've given to the government, which is a comprehensive review of the entire labour supply chain, all the legislation, and how it should be changed in order to make the supply chain work better. And part of that is, a tax should trigger rights. So if you're paying full employment taxes, you should really get the rights with it, and that would clear up that particular problem. But obviously, this is all still up in the air.
Yeah, and like we hear time and time again, just going back to the original point on, you know, what companies should do about this, where, you know, the first thing an HR or a finance leader will do is pull an AP report, or you know, look at their supplier list in whatever system they use, and it uncovers just, you know, it doesn't just open up a question of joint and several liability. It opens up IR35 risk. There'll be self-employed sole traders in there. There'll be overseas workers, and so on and so forth. So I think, you know, the general advice I think that that we give customers, and I think, you know, anyone on the call can reach out, and will definitely be, you know, you can reach out to Rebecca and Chris directly as well on LinkedIn and things like that, is to just first things first, get an understanding of what's in front of you, because there's more legislation coming, right? This all feels like it's all still in flight.
It is. I think this is a stepping stone to further. You know, we know that the Employment Rights Act will define umbrella companies. There is a situation where they will be regulated in the same way as an agency, and that has impositions on the conduct regulations, etc., etc. So it's about keeping an eye on that and understanding it. But from a supply chain perspective, that really need to have a way of just being able to look through that supply chain in the easiest way. And we've spoken about this before, Sam, on numerous occasions. I think the best way of doing that is through a tech-enabled kind of process, something that allows you to understand where your workers are at all times. You know, this isn't about the Employment Rights Act, but we've got, you know, potentially payments for late notification of shifts. Okay, and as the world currently stands, there's going to be a lot of payments there unless we can automate that process.
Yeah.
And, in the same way, if you have that, then you'll understand where your populations are, where your risk is, where you know how to avoid that risk. And I think, you know, that only comes with having good technology and processes that you need to implement.
Yeah, I think it's all well and good if anyone's on the call and they have a handful of contractors and a handful of umbrellas. You know, it's a relatively simple exercise. I think when you get into dozens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, you know, it's just so surprising how businesses aren't looking at this section of the workforce. Sometimes, you know, there could be thousands of workers and there's no technology in place. We've just a little segue onto the Q&A here. Thanks very much for everybody for your questions. We've had one question specifically on Worksome. And as a Worksome customer, what due diligence are we doing regarding umbrella companies? We'll be following up with a note directly addressing that. I think we've got 25-30% of the people on the call are actual Worksome customers. So that will, if that's not clear, that will be made very clear. The way we're seeing this, as you know, as a Worksome, as a platform and a services company for our customers, is, you know, in many scenarios, we're actually contracting the umbrella companies on your behalf. So, you know, Worksome operates as that kind of insulation, I guess, to joint several liability. But we'll be following up with some information on that. And we've had a very specific question for you, Chris, regarding Dutch-style G accounts, which is straight over my head.
I saw that, and I actually collaborated on an article about this prior to the consultation.
Oh, right.
Because it works in the same way, and I'm trying to simplify this, is, you know, if you're renting accommodation and you have to pay your landlord a deposit, that money goes into that account, and neither you or the landlord can dip into that at any time it's paid over.
Right.
I think it was something that we looked at along with, and we proposed that, as well as some kind of licensing of umbrella companies. At the same time, I think, and I think Rebecca touched on it before, is that anything like that will create more work for the government to manage, and they tend to stay away from that. So I think it's a great idea. I think it secures it.
Well, they're not doing it anyway, so it's irrelevant.
They're not doing it. I get that, but I think it was one of those things that people were proposing alongside.
Yeah.
Because the money's there, it's safe, and it can't go anywhere.
So we've noted who asked the question, so we could actually just reach out directly as well if they want to have a direct conversation. And then another question has come in. Compliance, this is a good one. Compliance comes at a cost. Broadly on the panel, even finger in the air, can we estimate what this kind of the cost of this compliance would look like? And I think I'll start, but I think, practically when it comes to actually what to do, I think it'd be good to hear you both on this. But, any prospective customer of Worksome, whether it's, HR, talent, procurement, or a tax director who wants to solve a compliance problem, we really try and make this a multifaceted business case to solve for. There's a lot of fear mongering in the UK market. There are a lot of products that put bandages over scratches and push them to the side. I think you really need to be focusing, like Chris said here, is what technology solves this, but also gives the business other benefits. Can we create efficiencies? Can we create more productivity? Can we solve other problems with a product, or billing and invoicing and contracting and everything else, rather than just focusing on compliance? Because very often compliance solutions are expensive and they don't really solve much bar adding some red tape.
Well, I mean, that is a really interesting point, because I've seen an absolute proliferation in the compliance market as well as tech platforms, Worksome being one of them. So that is another point, actually, that you need to be auditing or asking questions of Worksome, and obviously I know that, Worksome are quite happy to answer them. So, that's another point, actually, which I have made, close to sort of DBT, that there are a lot of compliance platforms now, and you've got to be able to trust your compliance platform, because they are, they run properly, like Worksome, they're doing not only the job of compliance, but also all sorts of other jobs like contractor management. So, that's one point. And because we're short of time here, I really want to make a point about LinkedIn and other social media. There is a lot of misinformation from people who sound like they know what they're talking about, but things like when people are putting out posts saying there's a collective liability under joint and several liability, that's just not true. The legislation is very clear about who is liable in what particular circumstance. There's also a lot of commercial incentives here. So people wanting to sell you products that are going to benefit them but don't necessarily benefit you. So be really careful about using actual experts, listening to actual experts, as Sam said. And I would say that, wouldn't I? But I just see so much misinformation online. So just be careful on that score as well.
I'd agree on that. There's lots of people pushing their own narrative on this, and it's for their own ends. Just ensure that you understand the detail of what's required here from you. And going back to that cost element, and we as an industry understand that we need to provide that reassurance, and the cost of an FCSA accreditation is with the umbrella company. The cost of SafeRec is with the umbrella company. That doesn't, however, mitigate the fact that this is an ongoing risk management process for you. So there will be a cost element, but I truly believe, you've got to look at the value of that, the value that the umbrella and the agencies bring to you in those services. And if you put that against what you're going to actually pay out, it'll be worth it, basically.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rebecca. Thanks so much, Chris. If this session here for everybody attending has raised questions around around your own supply chain and how you wish to go about it, we've shared a link. I think we're sharing a link now. That a link will follow on, so you can schedule a short conversation with us directly. And please do reach out to Chris and Rebecca directly as well. They're both very active in this space and on LinkedIn. And you can kind of at the very least follow them to stay in the loop with what's going on with the legislation. And if you're a Worksome customer, again, like as I said, either reach out to your customer success manager. You'll be receiving comms on joint and several liability and the changes regardless. Thanks very much, everybody.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.